The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in shafts of amber and crimson, painting the October forest in colors that would be beautiful if they didn't mark the dying season. Ezekiel Thorne worked alone in the family cemetery, 200 yards uphill from the log cabin where his wife watched from the doorway. His hands, weathered and scarred from 55 years of living, moved with surprising delicacy as he carved symbols into a wooden grave marker. The chisel traced geometric patterns into white oak, circles intersecting with crosses, spirals that led to star shapes, lines that connected in ways that suggested both map and warning. The marker stood upright in the rocky soil, one of 11 such monuments scattered across the south-facing slope. Each faced west toward the limestone bluffs that rose like ancient sentinels 3 miles distant. Ezekiel paused to wipe his blade on his canvas workshirt, examining the symbol he'd just completed. 7 lines radiating from a central point, each terminating in a small circle. His lips moved as he worked, forming words in a language that wasn't quite Gaelic, wasn't quite Cherokee, but something older that lived in the spaces between known tongues. The words translated roughly to protection, threshold, and price paid willingly. Mercy Thorne stood in the cabin doorway, one hand gripping the rough-hewn frame, the other clutching a bundle of dried sage and yarrow tied with red thread. Her dark hair, streaked with gray at 48, disappeared beneath a black bonnet that shadowed her face. She'd worn mourning clothes since their daughter died of winter fever in 1850. And the black had become so familiar that neighbors in Salem claimed they'd never seen her in any other color. Now, watching her husband prepare his own grave marker with the methodical care he'd brought to every stone he'd ever laid, she felt the familiar weight of knowledge pressing against her chest. This was the 3rd time she'd stood witness to this ritual. Her father-in-law had carved his own marker the day before he died. Her mother-in-law had done the same. The Thorne family didn't wait for others to commemorate them. They announced their own departures. The first toll of the bell cut through the afternoon stillness like a knife through silk. Mercy's breath caught, though she'd been expecting it. The sound came from above, from the sky that had been empty moments before. Now, a dark shape circled against the orange-painted clouds, its wingspan enormous even at this distance. The Belled Buzzard had returned. Around its neck, suspended from a leather cord that shouldn't have survived the bird's constant movement, hung a copper bell no larger than a man's thumb. With each powerful beat of those massive wings, the bell tolled, clear, mournful, perfectly pitched, to carry through the valley and echo from the limestone cliffs until it seemed the entire Ozark wilderness participated in the announcement of impending death. 3 miles away, on the rutted path that connected the Thorne Hollow to Salem Township, Silas Thorne heard the bell and froze mid-stride. The flour sack he'd been carrying slipped from his shoulder and hit the ground in a white explosion of dust. At 19, tall and gaunt with his father's granite jaw and his mother's dark eyes, Silas had heard stories about the Belled Buzzard his entire life. He'd seen the creature twice before, once when his grandfather died, once when his sister succumbed to fever, but knowing what the bell meant didn't lessen its impact. If anything, certainty made it worse. He ran. The forest path blurred past him as he sprinted uphill, lungs burning in the cool October air. Branches whipped at his face and arms, but he barely felt them. Behind him, the forgotten flour sack leaked its contents into the dirt where deer would lick it come morning, drawn by the salt and minerals. Ahead, the bell continued its measured tolling, each peal marking time toward an inevitable conclusion. Silas burst into the clearing just as his father collapsed beside the half-finished grave marker. Ezekiel Thorne crumpled like a marionette with cut strings, one hand still gripping the carving chisel, the other pressed against his chest, where his heart labored against some invisible, crushing weight. His face had gone gray, the weathered tan of outdoor work bleaching to the color of limestone. His lips moved, but no sound emerged except a wet rattling that came from deep in his chest. Mercy moved before Silas could react, crossing the distance from cabin to cemetery with practiced efficiency. She knelt beside her husband, one hand checking his pulse at the throat, the other pressing against his forehead. Her touch was gentle, despite the urgency. "Help me carry him inside," she said to Silas, her voice steady and low. "Mind his head." Together they lifted Ezekiel, who seemed to weigh nothing despite his broad frame. The years of masonry work had built dense muscle, but now it felt as if the essential substance of him had already begun departing, leaving only the shell behind. They carried him into the cabin's single main room, where a fire crackled in the fieldstone hearth. Mercy directed Silas to lay his father on the rope bed in the corner, then moved immediately to the shelves where she kept her medicines. The cabin's interior smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and the earthy scent of root vegetables stored in barrels. Bundles of plants hung from the rafters: yarrow, sage, boneset, feverfew, and dozens of others Silas couldn't name despite having grown up surrounded by them. His mother had knowledge that went beyond frontier medicine, passed down through generations of women who'd served as healers in Scotland, Ireland, and whatever older places the family line traced back to before names and nations mattered. Mercy worked with focused intensity, crushing dried leaves in a wooden mortar, mixing tinctures, speaking in tones too low for Silas to distinguish individual words. Were they prayers, incantations, medical instructions she gave herself to maintain focus? He'd never been certain, and she'd never explained. The Thorne family kept its knowledge close, shared it carefully, and never justified itself to outsiders or even sometimes to their own children. Outside, the Belled Buzzard continued its vigil, circling the hollow in a widening gyre. Through the cabin's small windows, Silas could see its shadow pass across the walls in regular intervals, and each time the shadow crossed, the bell tolled. The sound had a quality that made his teeth ache, not loud but penetrating, as if it bypassed his ears entirely and resonated directly in his bones. He'd heard old-timers in Salem say that the bell didn't make sound at all. It made memory, reminded people of every loss they'd ever suffered, every death they'd witnessed. Silas didn't know if that was true, but he knew the sound made him want to run until he couldn't hear it anymore. "Sit with him," Mercy said, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. "Talk to him. Let him hear your voice." Silas settled onto a three-legged stool beside the bed, unsure what to say. His father had never been a talkative man. Their conversations usually centered on work, how to fit stones together, which trees made the best grave markers, how to read the land for water and stability. Ezekiel Thorne had taught his son masonry through demonstration rather than explanation, believing that hands learned better than ears. "Pa," Silas began, then stopped. "What did you say to a dying man? That you loved him? That you'd miss him?" Those things seemed both too large and too small for the moment. He tried again. "I got the flour from Pritchard's store. He asked about you, said he'd heard you were working on that chimney foundation for the Ashcroft place." No response. Ezekiel's eyes remained closed, his breathing shallow and irregular. Mercy moved around them like water around stones, placing heated cloths on her husband's chest, dripping tinctures onto his tongue, maintaining her low, murmured litany. The firelight cast her shadow huge against the log walls, and for a moment Silas saw her as others must, a dark figure engaged in mysterious practices, speaking words that sounded like sorcery to ears untrained in the old languages. But she was just his mother, tired, aging, doing everything she knew how to do, even though they all understood it wouldn't be enough. Death had announced itself with a copper bell, and death kept its appointments. As twilight deepened outside, painting the forest in shades of purple and gray, Ezekiel's eyes opened. They focused first on the rafters overhead, then slowly tracked to his wife's face, and finally to his son's. Recognition flickered there, along with something that might have been regret or perhaps satisfaction at a job completed. His hand, the one that had been clutching his chest, moved with great effort to grasp Silas's wrist. The grip was weak, but deliberate. "Listen," Ezekiel whispered, his voice like wind through dead leaves. "The work isn't finished. Someone has to tend them, the markers, the patterns. Do you understand?" Silas wanted to say yes, to give his father peace, but honesty prevented him. "No, Pa. I don't understand any of it. The symbols, the bells, why we have to live out here separate from everyone else. I don't understand what we're supposed to be protecting or from what." A ghost of a smile touched Ezekiel's grey lips. "Good. Honest. That's good." He coughed, and the sound rattled in his chest like dice in a cup. "You will, though, when you have to. The knowing comes with the doing. That's how it's always been." His grip tightened fractionally. "The bell marks us, but it also marks what we keep at bay. Don't let them convince you we're cursed. We're not cursed. We're necessary." "Who are they?" Silas asked. "The people in Salem or something else?" But Ezekiel's eyes had lost focus again, turning inward to whatever landscape the dying traveled through. Mercy placed a hand on Silas's shoulder, a gentle pressure that meant, "Let him go. Don't call him back. This is how it has to happen." They sat in silence as darkness completed its claim on the world outside. The fire burned low. The Belled Buzzard's tolling continued at precise intervals, every 3 minutes, Silas realized, counting in his head. 30 seconds of sound, 2.5 minutes of silence, then the bell again, like a clock measuring the remaining moments of his father's life. At some point, Silas must have dozed, because he jerked awake to find the cabin completely dark, except for the dying embers in the hearth. His mother sat motionless in her rocking chair, still as carved wood, her face invisible in shadow. The only sound was his father's breathing, which had changed from irregular gasps to something slower, deeper, more final. Each breath came further apart from the last, the pauses between them stretching into eternities. Then no breath came at all. The silence that followed felt absolute, as if the world itself held its breath. Silas waited, counting seconds, hoping for one more rise of his father's chest. But Ezekiel Thorne had finished his work and departed without fanfare, as quietly as he'd lived. Outside, the Belled Buzzard's tolling ceased immediately. The final peal cut short mid-ring, leaving only the night sounds of the forest, wind through pine branches, the distant call of an owl, the creek's constant murmur over stones. Mercy rose from her chair and lit a candle. In its flickering light, her face showed no tears, only a profound exhaustion that went beyond sleeplessness. She moved to the bed and closed her husband's eyes with gentle fingers, then pulled a quilt up to cover him. "Help me wash him," she said to Silas. "We'll bury him tomorrow at first light. The ground is still soft enough." They worked together through the remaining hours of darkness, preparing the body according to practices Mercy had learned from her own mother, who'd learned them from hers, stretching back through generations to places and times Silas could only imagine. They washed Ezekiel with water drawn from Weaver Creek, dressed him in clean, undyed linen, wrapped him in a sheet that smelled of cedar and sage. Mercy arranged autumn leaves around the body, oak, maple, hickory, and placed acorns at the cardinal points, north, south, east, west. Then she added the bells, small copper bells, each no larger than a thimble, carefully positioned in a pattern Silas didn't understand. 7 bells total, arranged in the same radiating star pattern his father had been carving into the grave marker. When a draft moved through the cabin, they chimed softly, creating harmonies that seemed almost musical despite being random. Almost musical, but not quite. There was something deliberate in how those random chimes aligned, as if the bells were tuning themselves to frequencies human ears could barely detect. Silas shivered despite the warmth from the rebuilt fire. His mother noticed. "You feel it," she said, not a question. The pattern trying to complete itself. Your father started the work. Now it wants to be finished. She looked at him with an intensity that made him want to turn away. You can refuse, Silas. You can walk away from all of this. Go to Salem. Find work that makes sense to people. Marry a girl whose family won't whisper about yours. I won't blame you. This life isn't easy, and the rewards aren't the kind you can spend or show to neighbors. What are the rewards? Silas asked. Mercy was quiet for a long moment, knowing that something worse hasn't happened, that the threshold holds, that the doors stay closed. She shook her head. I know that doesn't help. It's like asking someone to be grateful for all the disasters that didn't occur. But that's what we do. We maintain the boundaries, we pay the price, and we do it quietly so others can sleep soundly in their ignorance. The first grey light of dawn was seeping through the windows when they finally finished the preparations. Silas stepped outside to breathe air that didn't smell of death and ritual, and found himself staring at the cemetery upslope. Even in the dim pre-dawn light, he could see the grave marker his father had been carving, still standing upright next to the freshly dug hole. The symbols were incomplete, the pattern unfinished. His father's chisel lay in the grass where it had fallen. Silas picked it up. The wooden handle was worn smooth by decades of use, fitted perfectly to his father's grip. It felt strange in his own hand, too small and too large at once. He looked at the unfinished marker, at the partially carved symbol that needed 7 radiating lines, but only had 5. His father's last instruction echoed in his memory. The work isn't finished. Someone has to tend them. Behind him, his mother emerged from the cabin, carrying the wrapped body with a strength that belied her size. She'd done this before, Silas realized, carried the dead alone when she had to. The Thorne family didn't wait for help that would never come willingly. They managed their own burials, spoke their own rites, maintained their own vigil against whatever darkness pressed against the boundaries they guarded. Above them, the sky lightened from grey to pale blue. Birds began their morning songs. The Belled Buzzard was nowhere to be seen, as if it had never existed, except in fevered imagination. But the copper bell his father had been buried with would remain in the earth, along with all the others, marking graves that faced west instead of east, announcing to anyone with eyes to see that the Thorne family refused to conform even in death. Silas carried the chisel upslope to where his mother waited beside the grave. He looked at her, asking a silent question. She nodded once. Together, they lowered Ezekiel Thorne into the earth while the October dawn broke cold and clear across the Ozark Mountains, and somewhere deep in the limestone caves beneath their feet, something that had been listening to the bells decided to wait a while longer before testing the threshold. The news reached Salem before dawn, carried by Luther Crenshaw, whose farm bordered the Thorne property 3 miles to the east. He'd been checking his tobacco-curing barn when he heard it, the tolling of that damned bell, clear as church chimes despite the distance. Everyone in Christian County knew what that sound meant. One of those Thorne people had died. Luther crossed himself, a habit from childhood Catholicism he'd never quite shed, despite converting to Methodism to fit in with his neighbors, and counted the tolls. 37 in total, before the sound cut off abruptly, leaving a silence that felt worse than any noise. He didn't sleep after that. Come first light, he hitched his mule and rode to Salem with the news. By the time Reverend Thomas Ashford rang the church bell for morning prayer, a different kind of sound had infected the township, the buzz of speculation that masqueraded as concern, but smelled distinctly of fear. The township square occupied maybe 3 acres of cleared land at the intersection of 2 rutted paths that optimistically called themselves roads. A courthouse built of rough-sawn lumber dominated one side, its second story serving as courtroom, meeting hall, and occasional dance floor. Across the square stood Pritchard's General Store, a log building with a covered porch where men gathered to discuss weather, crops, politics, and, this October morning, the Thorne family. The Methodist church anchored the north end of the square, while a blacksmith's shop, a smokehouse, and a handful of cabins completed the settlement. 200 souls called Salem home, enough to feel like civilization after a week in the wilderness, small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did. Martha Greaves arrived at Pritchard's store shortly after dawn. Her wagon loaded with empty barrels she needed filled with flour and salt. At 52, she'd been widowed twice and had birthed or midwifed most of the children in the county. Her homestead sat on the eastern edge of Salem, isolated enough for her to maintain the privacy she preferred, but close enough to town to hear its heartbeat. This morning, that heartbeat felt irregular, panicked. Martha, and called Ezra Stevens from the store porch, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a man about to ask invasive questions. Heard about Ezekiel Thorne. Luther said the bell rang half the night. You delivered 2 of their babies, didn't you? Back in 49 and 50. Martha climbed down from her wagon slowly, buying time to compose her face into neutral lines. I did. Both healthy births. Both babies survived, which is more than can be said for most deliveries out here. But what did you see? This from Emma Yates, a shopkeeper's wife with a talent for gossip. When you were in that cabin, what kind of things did that woman have hanging from the rafters? What did she say when the children came out? She said the things all mothers say, Martha replied, her tone frosty enough to discourage further questioning. It didn't work. But the stories, Emma pressed, moving closer, about how they bury people facing west, about the symbols on the grave markers, about that bird with the bell around its neck. You must have seen something strange in that hollow. You can tell us. We're just trying to understand. Understand. Martha resisted the urge to laugh bitterly. These people didn't want understanding. They wanted confirmation of their prejudices, validation for their fear of anything that didn't fit neatly into their worldview. She'd seen this pattern before. Different town, different family, same willful ignorance masquerading as righteous concern. I saw a woman who knew more about healing than most doctors, Martha said flatly. I saw a family that kept to themselves and bothered nobody. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have supplies to purchase. She pushed past them into the store, leaving a wake of offended silence. Inside, Samuel Pritchard stood behind his counter, arranging stock with the methodical precision that characterized everything he did. At 33, he was one of the few educated men in the county, having studied natural sciences at a college in Massachusetts before heading west to seek his fortune. That fortune had eluded him, but his curiosity hadn't. He served as county clerk, store owner, and unofficial documentarian of everything that occurred in Christian County. "Good morning, Martha," he said, genuinely pleased to see her. "I'll have your flour and salt ready shortly. I heard about Ezekiel Thorne." "Everyone's heard," Martha replied, "and everyone has opinions despite knowing nothing." Pritchard nodded toward the ledger open on his counter. "I've been documenting death records since I arrived 3 years ago. Ezekiel is the 3rd death this month. That's unusually high for October." "It's the season change," Martha said. "Always brings fevers and chills. Nothing mysterious about it." "Perhaps?" Pritchard turned the ledger so she could see the careful columns of names, dates, and causes of death. "But look at the pattern. All 3 deaths occurred within 5 miles of the Thorne property, and if you go back through previous years, you'll see something interesting." He pulled out a hand-drawn map covered with black pins marking death locations, and 1 red pin marking the Thorne cemetery. "Every autumn since the Thornes arrived in 47, there's a cluster of deaths in this radius. Never more than 20, never fewer than 12. This year we're only at 3 so far, but the pattern is consistent." Martha studied the map, feeling cold despite the warmth radiating from the pot-bellied stove in the corner. She'd noticed similar patterns in her own records, but had dismissed them as coincidence. Seeing them visualized made them harder to ignore. "What are you suggesting, Samuel?" "I'm not suggesting anything," he said carefully. "I'm documenting. But others will draw conclusions. Some already are." He gestured toward the window, where a small crowd had gathered on the porch, their voices rising in agitation. "They're frightened, and frightened people do terrible things." Before Martha could respond, the store door burst open and Ruth Harper stumbled inside, her mother Ellen supporting her. The 12-year-old girl looked terrible, face pale, eyes circled with dark rings, body trembling despite the thick shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Ellen Harper's expression held the particular terror of a mother watching her child suffer without understanding why. "Please," Ellen said, her voice cracking. "Martha, Samuel, someone. She won't eat, won't sleep, just keeps drawing those symbols over and over." She held out a crumpled paper covered with geometric patterns, circles, stars, spirals, shapes that looked familiar to anyone who'd glimpsed the Thorne grave markers. "She says she hears bells in her dreams. Says something is trying to get out." Ruth lifted her head and Martha saw recognition in the girl's fevered eyes. "You've been there," Ruth whispered. "To their cemetery. You've seen the patterns. Why do they face west, Mrs. Greaves? Why do all the graves look towards sunset instead of toward the resurrection?" The store went silent. Even Pritchard, usually quick with rational explanations, seemed at a loss. Martha knelt beside the girl, placing a cool hand on her forehead. Fever, definitely, but something else too. She'd seen this look before. In people who'd glimpsed things they weren't meant to see, knowledge that burned like hot coals in unprepared minds. "Ruth, honey, when did you see the Thorne cemetery?" "I didn't," Ruth said, her voice distant. "But I saw the bird, the one with the bell. It landed on our fence post the night before Grandmother died last summer. It looked at me, Mrs. Greaves, looked right at me like it knew my name. And after Grandmother passed, I started dreaming about the cemetery. Every night, the same dream. I walk through the forest and find the graves, and I can read the symbols like they're written in words I've always known. They're not curses, Mrs. Greaves. They're warnings, instructions. They say this far and no further. They say the threshold holds here. They say 7 marks the boundary, 9 closes the door, and 0 is the nothing we keep outside." Ellen Harper made a small, desperate sound. "She's been saying things like this for days. Nothing makes sense. Please, someone tell me what's wrong with my daughter." Martha knew exactly what was wrong, but saying it aloud would only make things worse. The girl had been marked somehow, touched by whatever forces the Thorne family spent their lives managing. Whether through actual supernatural contact or simply the power of suggestion and fever working together, Ruth had become sensitive to things most people never noticed. The question was whether that sensitivity would fade or deepen. "Take her to see Mercy Thorne," Martha said quietly. The store erupted. Ellen Harper recoiled as if struck. Samuel Pritchard started to object on grounds of medical sense. Outside on the porch, voices rose in protest. But Martha held firm, keeping her hand on Ruth's burning forehead. "That woman is the only person I know who might understand what's happening to your daughter," Martha said. "You can take my advice or not, but if this were my child, I'd swallow my pride and go where the knowledge is, even if that place makes me uncomfortable." Ellen Harper wavered, torn between maternal instinct and social pressure. Ruth made the decision for her by collapsing sideways, her body seized by convulsions that made her limbs jerk and her teeth clench. Martha and Ellen caught her before she hit the floor, and in that moment of crisis, pride became irrelevant. "Someone fetch Dr. Morrison," Samuel Pritchard shouted, but Martha shook her head. "He's 2 days away on his circuit. By the time he gets here, it'll be too late. Ellen, get your husband. Tell him to prepare the wagon. We're going to the Thorne homestead." The look Ellen gave her held equal parts gratitude and terror, but she nodded and ran from the store, half carrying Ruth with her. The crowd on the porch parted reluctantly, faces showing the complex calculus of judgment, disapproval of associating with the Thornes versus recognition that desperate times called for desperate measures. Martha turned to Pritchard. "Make a note in your ledger, Samuel. October 22nd, 1853. Ruth Harper taken ill with fever and visions. Family seeking help from Mercy Thorne." "You think she can help?" Pritchard asked. "I think she's the only one who might," Martha replied. She gathered her skirts and headed for the door, then paused. "And Samuel, that pattern you've been documenting? Consider the possibility that the Thornes aren't causing those deaths. Consider that they might be preventing more." She left him with that thought, heading back to her wagon. As she drove out of Salem toward her homestead to gather medical supplies for the journey to Weaver Creek, Martha mentally reviewed everything she knew about Mercy Thorne. The woman had helped deliver difficult births with remedies that worked when conventional medicine failed. She'd set broken bones with hands that seemed to intuit the body's architecture. She'd turned fevers and eased dying without the dramatics most frontier healers employed for show. But she'd also done things Martha couldn't explain. Spoken words in languages that predated English, arranged objects in patterns that made Martha's skin prickle with inexplicable unease, demonstrated knowledge of plants and their uses that went far beyond herbalism into something that felt like actual magic. Martha wasn't sure she believed in such things, but she'd seen results that defied rational explanation, and in the end, results mattered more than comfort. Meanwhile, across the township, Reverend Thomas Ashford sat in his small chapel office, the news of Ezekiel Thorne's death heavy on his mind. The circuit-riding Methodist preacher covered 5 counties on a rotating schedule, spending 2 weeks in each before moving on. Salem was his anchor point, the place he returned to most frequently. And over 3 years, he developed genuine care for these people, despite their provincial superstitions. But the Thorne family troubled him. He'd tried to reach them with the gospel, made 3 separate visits to their hollow in his first year, bringing Bibles and offers of spiritual guidance. Mercy had been polite, but firm in her refusals. "We have our own understanding with the divine, Reverend," she'd said. "It may not look like yours, but it serves the same purpose, keeping the darkness at bay." He'd argued that Christ was the only light humanity needed. She'd smiled sadly and replied, "Then your Christ and our old ways must be allies because we fight the same enemy." The conversation had haunted him. What enemy? What darkness? Were these just metaphors for sin and temptation, or did the Thorne family genuinely believe in literal forces of supernatural malevolence? And if the latter, were they deluded or correct? Ashford pulled out his journal, a leather-bound book where he documented his ministerial activities, and turned to a section he'd titled Spiritual Disturbances. The pages contained accounts of strange occurrences that didn't fit neatly into either faith or reason. Unexplained healings, accurate premonitions, animals behaving in ways that suggested intelligence beyond instinct. And running through these accounts like a dark thread, the Thorne family name appeared again and again, not as perpetrators, but as witnesses, participants, or sometimes solutions to problems that defied conventional intervention. He made a decision that surprised himself. Tomorrow he would ride to the Thorne homestead, ostensibly to offer condolences for Ezekiel's death, but truly to confront his own doubts. He needed to see their cemetery, to examine those symbols everyone whispered about, to understand whether this family represented spiritual danger or simply spiritual difference. The distinction mattered more than comfortable ignorance allowed. As October afternoon faded toward evening, Salem buzzed with anxiety and speculation. In Pritchard's store, men gathered to voice opinions about what should be done about the Thorne situation. In the church, a prayer meeting spontaneously formed, voices rising in hymns that felt more like protective wards than worship. And on the road leading east out of town, a single wagon carried a fevered child toward a lonely hollow where smoke rose from a chimney and fresh earth marked a grave that faced the wrong direction. The Belled Buzzard, if it watched from limestone perches high in the bluffs, kept its own counsel. But that night, 3 people in Salem reported hearing bells echoing from the hills. Faint, distant, but distinct. Samuel Pritchard marked each report in his ledger with mounting unease. The pattern was accelerating. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Thorne homestead, the October sun painting frost into diamonds across the meadow grass. Reverend Thomas Ashford arrived on horseback just as light touched the eastern sky, having left Salem before dawn to make the 3-mile journey. He'd told himself this was a routine pastoral visit, but the Bible in his saddlebag felt heavier than usual, and the journal where he documented spiritual disturbances pressed against his ribs like a secret he'd been keeping from himself. He found Mercy and Silas Thorne already awake, moving with the purposeful exhaustion of people who'd been working through the night. Ezekiel's body lay on a wooden board in the main room of the cabin, wrapped in undyed linen that smelled of cedar and herbs Ashford couldn't identify. Around the corpse, arranged with geometric precision, were objects that made the Reverend's theological training and practical experience clash with uncomfortable friction. Autumn leaves, oak, maple, hickory created a border around the body, each leaf placed with its stem pointing toward the corpse's head. 7 acorns sat at cardinal and intercardinal points like compass markings, and scattered across the linen wrapping in a pattern that suggested both randomness and deep intentionality were small copper bells, each no larger than a child's fingernail, positioned in a radiating star configuration that matched symbols Ashford had seen carved into trees throughout these hills. Reverend. Mercy acknowledged his presence without surprise, as if she'd been expecting him. Her face showed the exhaustion of grief and sleeplessness, but her eyes remained clear and focused. "Have you come to pray over my husband?" "I came to offer whatever comfort the Lord might provide," Ashford replied carefully, "and to extend my condolences. Ezekiel was known as a skilled craftsman and an honest man, whatever else people might say." "Whatever else people might say," Mercy repeated with a ghost of bitter amusement. "A diplomatic way to acknowledge that most of Salem considers us at best peculiar and at worst dangerous." She gestured toward the body. "You're welcome to speak your prayers, Reverend. They won't harm anything, but we'll be burying him according to our own customs afterward." Ashford dismounted and approached the cabin, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. The interior smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something else, a scent he couldn't name that seemed to bypass his nose and register directly in his hindbrain as significant, important, charged with meaning his conscious mind couldn't access. He stood beside the body and tried to begin the traditional prayers for the dead, but the words stuck in his throat. "Mrs. Thorne," he said instead, "forgive me, but I must speak plainly. I've served this community for 3 years, and in that time, your family has been the subject of constant speculation and no small amount of fear. I've defended you from the pulpit, argued that difference doesn't equal evil, urged my congregation toward Christian charity. But I confess, my own understanding falls short. These symbols, these rituals, they're not Christian. They're not even clearly pagan in any tradition I recognize. What are you protecting? What are you maintaining? And why must you do it in ways that separate you from every other family in this county? Mercy studied him for a long moment, her expression weighing something Ashford couldn't fathom. Finally, she spoke. Come with us to the burial. Watch what happens, and then decide for yourself whether your theology has room for what you witness, or whether the universe is larger and stranger than the Bible makes comfortable allowance for. There was challenge in her voice, but also genuine invitation, as if she too was tired of isolation and secrecy, but couldn't abandon her responsibilities even for the relief of being understood. Ashford nodded. I'll come, and I'll watch with open eyes. Silas emerged from the barn carrying a wooden coffin he'd spent the night constructing. Simple pine boards, joined with wooden pegs rather than nails, sanded smooth but undecorated except for symbols carved into the lid. The same symbols his father had been inscribing on the grave marker. 7 radiating lines from a central point, each terminating in a small circle. Ashford recognized elements of the design from his limited studies of mysticism, Celtic knotwork, astronomical signs, protective wards from multiple traditions braided together into something unique. Why 7? Ashford asked. That number appears repeatedly in your carvings. Silas glanced at his mother, who gave a small nod of permission. 7 marks the boundary, the young man said, repeating words he didn't fully understand himself. 9 closes the door. 0 is the nothing we keep outside. The phrase struck Ashford as both profound and disturbing. He wanted to ask more, but Mercy had already moved to begin transferring her husband's body from the board into the coffin. Ashford and Silas helped, lifting the wrapped corpse with careful reverence. As they settled Ezekiel into his final resting place, Mercy added items that made Ashford's discomfort deepen into something approaching fear. First, Ezekiel's carving tools, chisel, mallet, and a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of metal on metal, then bundles of herbs tied with red thread, each bundle precisely measured and positioned at specific points within the coffin. Next, stones marked with the same symbols that appeared on the grave markers, arranged around the body like protective sentinels. And finally, a small leather-bound book filled with writing in a script Ashford had never encountered. Not Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew, but something that looked simultaneously ancient and newly invented. What language is that? He asked, pointing to the book. Several, Mercy replied, mixed together over generations until they became something new. Instructions, warnings, records of what worked and what didn't when trying to maintain the threshold. What threshold? Mercy's smile was sad. Come to the burial, Reverend. Watch, and maybe you'll understand why some questions shouldn't be answered in words. They carried the coffin uphill to the cemetery, a silent procession of 3 through morning mist that clung to the ground like reluctant spirits. The burial ground occupied a south-facing slope where the sun would warm the earth first after winter frost. 11 wooden markers stood at irregular intervals, all facing west toward the limestone bluffs that rose in the distance. Each marker bore different symbols, but all shared common elements: the radiating lines, the circles, patterns suggesting both map and mathematical formula. Ezekiel's grave waited open, a dark wound in the red clay soil. Beside it stood the marker he'd been carving before his death, still incomplete with only 5 of the 7 required lines inscribed. Silas had placed his father's chisel there, ready to complete the work his father had started. Shouldn't we complete the symbol before burial? Ashford asked. It seems incomplete. It is incomplete, Mercy confirmed. It will remain incomplete until Silas decides whether he's accepting the responsibility that comes with finishing it. She looked at her son with an expression that mingled love, regret, and something that might have been hope. Silas avoided her gaze, staring instead at the incomplete marker as if it might offer answers his mother hadn't provided. The moment stretched uncomfortably, and Ashford sensed he was witnessing a family crisis that went far deeper than decisions about woodcarving. "For now," Mercy continued, "we bury his body and mark his passage. The rest can wait." She positioned herself at the head of the grave, Silas and Ashford at the sides. "Lower him on my word, gently, he's going home." They lowered the coffin on ropes, hand over hand, until it settled at the bottom of the 6-foot-deep hole. The sound of wood meeting earth seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. Birds had fallen silent, even the ever-present rustle of wind through pine branches had ceased, as if the forest itself held its breath. Mercy reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a copper bell, identical to the ones scattered across her husband's wrapped body, identical to the bell worn by the creature that had announced his approaching death. She held it up, and even without ringing it, Ashford heard an echo. Not with his ears, but somewhere deeper, in the marrow of his bones where sound became feeling. "This is the last bell," Mercy said, speaking to the grave as much as to the living witnesses. 13 bells marked 13 thresholds, 7 above, 6 below, 13 in total to keep the door sealed. You carried your bells faithfully, husband. You walked your boundaries and spoke your warnings. Now your bell joins the others in the earth, and the pattern holds for another generation. She placed the bell in the grave atop the coffin, then began to sing. The melody that emerged from Mercy Thorne's throat bypassed Ashford's categorization as either hymn or folk song. It contained elements of Celtic lament, Native American chant, and something older that might have preceded both, a sound that felt less like music and more like fundamental vibration, the frequency at which stone resonated or water remembered its source. The language shifted mid-verse, from something that sounded like Gaelic to syllables that suggested Cherokee to sounds that belonged to no human tongue, Ashford recognized. And then the earth answered. Deep beneath their feet, from the limestone caves that honeycombed these hills, came a tolling of bells. Not one bell, but many, a cascade of copper voices rising from darkness into daylight. The sound emerged from the open grave, from cracks in the surrounding bedrock, from the very ground they stood upon. It built in waves, each peal overlapping the last, until the air vibrated with harmonics that made Ashford's vision blur and his balance waver. Silas stood transfixed, tears streaming down his face, though he made no sound. Mercy continued her singing, the melody weaving through the bell tones like thread through cloth, binding them into patterns that felt intentional despite their apparent chaos. And Ashford, his rational mind fracturing under the weight of phenomena his theology couldn't accommodate, saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. For just a moment, perhaps 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours, the boundary between what was real and what might be became transparent. The cemetery remained the cemetery, but overlaid upon it like a second image, slightly out of focus, appeared another version, older, darker, where the graves numbered in hundreds instead of 11, where the markers were stone instead of wood, and where things that weren't quite human stood sentinel at the borders. The vision flickered like heat shimmer, never quite solid, and through it all the bells tolled their warning. This far and no further, the threshold holds, the door stays closed. Then Mercy's song ended, the vision collapsed back into ordinary reality, and the bells fell silent all at once, leaving a quiet so profound that Ashford's ears rang with its absence. What? He started to say, but couldn't finish. What had he witnessed? What was he meant to do with knowledge that shattered his comfortable understanding of how the world worked? Mercy looked at him with something resembling pity. Now you see, Reverend. Now you understand why we live apart. Not because we're cursed, but because we carry responsibilities your people abandoned when they crossed the ocean in search of simpler lives. Someone must tend the thresholds. Someone must maintain the boundaries between what is and what would be if the doors opened. My husband's family has done this work for longer than surnames have existed. My family joined that work when I married into it. And now Silas must choose whether to continue it. But what are you keeping closed? Ashford demanded, his voice shaking. What's on the other side of those thresholds? Nothing, Silas said quietly, speaking for the first time since they'd begun the burial. Zero, the absence that would consume presence if given access. We don't keep demons at bay, Reverend. We keep nothingness from swallowing something, the void that predated creation and waits patiently for creation to end. 7 marks the boundary, 9 closes the door, and 0 is the nothing we keep outside. The explanation should have been ridiculous, the kind of mystical nonsense Ashford would have dismissed with easy certainty a week ago. But standing in that cemetery with the echoes of impossible bells still resonating in his bones, with the memory of that overlaid vision burning behind his eyes, he couldn't summon dismissal. Instead, he felt something close to terror at how little his education and faith had prepared him for a universe this large, this strange, this indifferent to human categories of understanding. As they began covering the coffin with earth, a shadow passed across the sun. Ashford looked up to find the Belled Buzzard circling overhead, descending in a tightening spiral. The bird was massive up close, its wingspan exceeding 5 feet, its feathers a mottled black-brown that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Around its neck, the copper bell hung from a leather cord worn smooth by years of contact. The creature landed not on a tree or fence post, but directly on the mound of excavated earth beside the open grave. This close, Ashford could see details that defied natural explanation. The way its eyes tracked with obvious intelligence, the manner in which it tilted its head as if listening to conversation beyond human hearing, the absolute stillness it maintained despite being a living thing that should have fidgeted or preened or shown some sign of animal restlessness. Mercy showed no surprise at its appearance. She moved to stand before the bird, and for a moment woman and creature regarded each other in silence. Then Mercy reached out slowly and placed her hand on the bird's head in something that looked like benediction or perhaps recognition between allies. The Belled Buzzard tolled once, a clear, bright sound, and from beneath their feet came an answering chime. Faint but distinct, as if the bells in the earth acknowledged the bell above it. "We hear you," Mercy said softly. "We remember. And we continue." The bird spread its wings and launched skyward with powerful strokes that stirred the air into small whirlwinds. It circled once, twice, then disappeared over the western bluffs toward the caves where limestone hid its secrets. The tolling of its bell faded gradually until only memory remained. Ashford became aware that he'd been holding his breath. He released it shakily and turned to find both Mercy and Silas watching him with expressions that blended concern and curiosity. They were waiting to see how he would respond, whether his faith could bend enough to accommodate what he'd witnessed or would snap under the strain. "Mrs. Thorne," he said finally, his voice rough, "may I see the grave markers? All of them. I want to understand the patterns." Relief flickered across Mercy's face. "Yes, Reverend, I'll show you. But understand, seeing the patterns doesn't mean you'll comprehend their function. Some knowledge requires not just observation, but participation. Still, you've earned the right to look." Neat. They spent the next hour walking among the 11 graves, while Mercy explained what she could in terms Ashford's educated mind might grasp. Each marker represented not just a buried body, but a sealed threshold, a point where the boundary between ordinary reality and whatever lay beyond had grown thin. The symbols were coordinates of a sort, describing the threshold's nature and the method required to keep it sealed. The bells added acoustic reinforcement, creating standing waves in the limestone that stabilized the boundaries. "But why you?" Ashford asked. "Why must one family bear this responsibility?" "Because someone must," Mercy replied simply. "Long ago, in places my husband's ancestors came from, every village had threshold keepers. They were honored, supported, given what they needed to do the work. But as people moved and traditions fragmented, the knowledge scattered. Some families kept it, most forgot. When we came to these hills, we found thresholds that had gone untended for generations, boundaries that had worn thin from neglect. So we stayed. We tend them. And yes, it isolates us. Yes, it makes us strange to our neighbors, but the alternative is worse." "What alternative?" Mercy gestured towards Salem, invisible beyond the trees but present in implication. "What happens when boundaries fail? When thresholds open? When nothing finds access to something? I don't know precisely, Reverend, because my family has succeeded in our work. But the old stories suggest emptiness spreading like plague, meaning draining from words, purpose leaching from action until everyone becomes hollow shells, going through motions they no longer remember the reasons for. Maybe that sounds metaphorical to you. Maybe it is, but maybe metaphor and reality intersect more often than comfortable philosophy admits." Ashford had no answer to that. He traced the symbols on the nearest grave marker with his finger, feeling the grooves Ezekiel's chisel had carved into wood. The pattern was beautiful in its complexity, mathematical yet organic, suggesting order that emerged from chaos rather than being imposed upon it. "What will you do now?" he asked Mercy. "With Ezekiel gone, What will you do now?" he asked Mercy. "With Ezekiel gone, can you maintain this work alone?" Mercy looked at Silas, who stood at his father's completed grave, staring at the incomplete marker. "That depends on my son. I can tend what's already sealed, but I can't create new wards. That requires strength I no longer have, and knowledge that only passes through the male line in our family, not because of any law, but because the work requires particular resonance with the limestone itself, and men's bones sing to stone differently than women's do." "That's not theology," Ashford said. "That's not even folk magic. That's something else entirely." "Yes," Mercy agreed. "It's older than both. It's the kind of knowledge humans possessed before we divided understanding into categories. Before we separated sacred from practical, spirit from matter, prayer from engineering. We used to know the world was unified, that working stone and calling the divine were aspects of the same fundamental practice. My husband's people remembered that. And now Silas must decide if he'll remember it too, or let the knowledge die with his father's generation." Ashford turned to the young man. "What do you want, Silas? What does your heart tell you?" Silas laughed bitterly. "My heart tells me I want a normal life. I want to court a girl without her father crossing himself when I approach. I want work that people understand and appreciate. I want to walk into Salem without hearing whispers or seeing people make warding signs behind my back. Is that wrong, Reverend? Is it sinful to want acceptance?" "No," Ashford said quietly. "It's deeply human. We're made for community, for fellowship. Isolation wounds us." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But we're also made for purpose. And sometimes purpose and comfort pull in opposite directions. I can't tell you which to choose. I can only say that running from responsibility doesn't make it disappear. It just leaves the work undone and the consequences unmanaged." Silas's expression cycled through anger, fear, resignation, and finally something that might have been reluctant acceptance. He knelt beside his father's marker and picked up the carving chisel. For a long moment he held it without moving, testing its weight, remembering the feel of his father's hand, guiding his when he was young, and learning the craft. Then, with deliberate care, he began carving. The chisel bit into wood, peeling away curls of white oak that fell like snow around the marker. Silas worked with focused intensity, his movements becoming more confident as muscle memory took over from conscious thought. He completed the 6th line, then the 7th, each radiating from the central point to terminate in a perfect circle. The pattern was finished. 7 marks for 7 boundaries. Whatever threshold this grave guarded was now fully sealed, at least according to the Thorne family's strange cartography of reality. As the final circle was completed, Ashford heard it again, that sound that wasn't quite sound, the deep subsonic vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. Not bells this time, but something like a sigh, as if the landscape itself had been holding tension that could now release. The feeling passed quickly, but it left Ashford with the unshakable conviction that something significant had just occurred. Some working had been completed that would hold consequences neither he nor Silas fully understood. Mercy placed her hand on her son's shoulder. No words passed between them, but Ashford saw the weight transfer from mother to son, the invisible burden of generational responsibility settling onto younger shoulders. Silas stood, dusting wood shavings from his clothes, and looked at the completed marker with an expression that mixed pride and resentment in equal measure. "It's done," Silas said. "For now. But I haven't decided anything beyond this, Ma. I finished what Pa started because it needed finishing. That doesn't mean I'm agreeing to spend my life carving symbols and living like an exile." "I know," Mercy replied. "The choosing comes daily, not once. You'll decide again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day, until either the work becomes your own, or you find the courage to walk away completely. I won't blame you either way, son. This life isn't easy, and the rewards are invisible to everyone except us." They stood together in the cemetery as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. Below them, smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, where breakfast cooked unattended. Around them, the forest gradually resumed its normal sounds, birds calling, branches creaking, the distant rush of Weaver Creek over stone. The moment of strangeness had passed, and ordinary reality reasserted itself with almost aggressive normalcy. But Ashford knew he would never experience ordinary reality the same way again. He'd glimpsed something beyond the comfortable boundaries of his theology, and that glimpse had changed him irrevocably. He thought of Paul on the Damascus road, struck blind by revelation too large for unprepared eyes. He thought of Moses before the burning bush, told to remove his shoes because the ground itself had become holy. He thought of every mystic and prophet who tried to explain the unexplainable and been dismissed as mad or heretical by those who preferred their universe small and manageable. "Thank you," he said to Mercy, "for letting me witness this, for trusting me with what you've shown me." "What will you tell your congregation?" Mercy asked, "when they demand to know what you saw here?" Ashford considered that carefully. "I'll tell them I witnessed a burial conducted according to the family's traditions. I'll tell them I found nothing evil or threatening in your practices. I'll tell them that difference doesn't equal danger, and that perhaps we should extend more charity and less judgment toward those whose paths diverge from our own." He paused. "I won't tell them about the bells or the visions or the way reality seemed to bend. They're not ready to hear that, and I'm not ready to explain it. Some truths are too large to be spoken. They have to be experienced." "A wise choice," Mercy said. "Speaking mystery aloud too often diminishes it into mere strangeness. Better to hold silence and let people discover their own paths to understanding." As Ashford prepared to depart, mounting his horse for the ride back to Salem, he noticed something that made him pause. The Belled Buzzard's leather cord, The one that had held the copper bell around the creature's neck lay coiled on a fence post near the cemetery entrance. The bell itself was gone, buried with Ezekiel, but the cord remained, as if left deliberately for someone to find. He picked it up, examining the smooth, worn leather that must have been ancient. "Take it," Mercy called from the cemetery. "Consider it a reminder that the world is wider than your sermons usually account for. And Reverend, when you pray tonight, pray not just for souls, but for thresholds. Pray that the boundaries hold. Pray that the work continues. Pray that enough people remember their responsibilities, that the great forgetting doesn't spread too far." Ashford tucked the leather cord into his Bible, right at the book of Job, where God challenges human presumption with questions about the foundations of the earth and the doors that hold back the sea. Then he rode toward Salem, his mind churning with implications that would occupy his thoughts for months to come. Behind him, the Thorne family returned to their cabin to break their fast and face another day of isolation, duty, and the quiet satisfaction of work that would never be celebrated because it prevented disasters no one else knew to fear. The disease came with the cold. As October gave way to November, temperatures plummeted and the first snow dusted the Ozark hills with white that turned the forest into skeletal beauty. With the cold came fever, spreading through Salem like fire through dry tinder. Samuel Pritchard watched his carefully maintained death records fill with alarming speed. 3 deaths became 5, then 8, then 12, all within the 5-mile radius centered on the Thorne cemetery, all occurring at night, all preceded by reports, increasingly frequent and impossible to dismiss as coincidence, of bells tolling from the limestone caves that honeycombed the hills. Pritchard worked through sleepless nights in his office above the general store, surrounded by maps covered with black pins marking death locations, ledgers filled with dates and symptoms, and a growing sense that the pattern he'd been documenting pointed toward truths he wasn't equipped to comprehend. His scientific training demanded rational explanations. Bad water, contaminated food, contagion spread through contact. But none of those explanations accounted for the geographic clustering, the acoustic phenomena, or the fact that mortality rates had actually declined after the Thornes arrived in 1847. He pulled out records from the previous county clerk, a man who'd served from 1842 until his death in 1846. Those earlier records showed autumn outbreaks claiming 20 to 30 lives annually. Since the Thornes had settled near Weaver Creek, the numbers had stabilized at 15 to 17 deaths per season. Pritchard stared at the figures until his eyes burned. The implication was impossible, yet the data supported it. Somehow, the Thorne family's presence correlated with reduced mortality, not increased, which meant the township's fear had been exactly backward. They weren't threatened by the Thornes, they were protected by them. The realization horrified him more than any supernatural explanation could have, because it revealed the cruelty of human nature more clearly than any ghost story. A family had been isolated, whispered about, treated with suspicion and barely concealed hostility, when in reality, they'd been performing some vital function that benefited everyone. The injustice of it gnawed at Pritchard's conscience. He descended the stairs to find his store crowded with anxious townspeople purchasing supplies for sick relatives. The atmosphere felt panicked, on the edge of mob mentality. Ezra Stevens was holding forth from his usual position near the pot-bellied stove, his voice carrying the dangerous certainty of the ignorant. "Started right after Ezekiel Thorne died," Stevens declared. "That's no coincidence. Something was keeping this sickness locked up, and now it's loose. Maybe the old man was the only thing standing between us and whatever curse that family brought to these hills." "That's the opposite of sense," Pritchard interjected, unable to contain his frustration. If anything, Ezekiel's death may have weakened whatever protection the Thornes were providing. The store went silent, Faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from confusion to anger. Emma Yates spoke first. Protection. Samuel, have you lost your reason? That family is the source of our troubles, not the solution. Show me your evidence, Pritchard challenged. Not rumors, not superstition. Actual evidence that the Thornes have caused harm. I'll wait. He gestured toward the stairs leading to his office. Meanwhile, I have documentation showing that death rates in this township were higher before the Thornes arrived than after. I have records proving that the disease outbreaks, while still occurring, have been less severe since 1847. These are facts, not feelings, and facts suggest we've been persecuting the very people who've been helping us. The pronouncement landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the assembled crowd. People didn't want their prejudices challenged with data. They wanted their fears validated. But Pritchard had crossed a threshold of his own. He could no longer remain neutral in the face of injustice, regardless of how strange the truth appeared. Before the argument could escalate, the store door burst open and Thomas Harper stumbled inside, his face grey with terror. "Please," he gasped. "My Ruth, she's dying. The fever won't break. Martha Greaves said to fetch Mercy Thorne, but I can't. I won't bring that woman into my home. Someone tell me there's another way." Samuel Pritchard made a decision that would define his character for the rest of his life. "I'll fetch her. I'll bring Mercy Thorne to your daughter, and I'll take full responsibility for the consequences." He grabbed his heavy coat from its peg and pushed past the shocked crowd toward the door. "You'll be cursed," Ezra Stevens warned. "You'll carry their strangeness back with you." "Then I'll be cursed," Pritchard replied. "But at least I'll have tried to save a child's life instead of letting her die to protect my comfortable ignorance." The ride to the Thorne homestead took an hour through increasingly heavy snow. Pritchard's horse labored up the forest path, breath steaming in the frigid air. By the time he reached the hollow where smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, his face was numb and his fingers stiff on the reins. He dismounted and approached the door, suddenly uncertain how to explain his presence. Mercy answered before he could knock, as if she'd been expecting him. "Someone's dying," she stated flatly, and Salem's pride finally bent enough to ask for help. "Ruth Harper," Pritchard confirmed. 12 years old, high fever, convulsions, seeing visions. "Martha Greaves said you might be able to help." "Might," Mercy echoed. "That's more honest than most would admit." She studied him with eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail. "You're the clerk, the one who keeps records. You've been documenting the patterns." "Yes, and I think I'm beginning to understand what they mean." "Good. Understanding costs less than ignorance, though most people prefer to pay the latter's price." She called over her shoulder into the cabin. "Silas, prepare the medicines. We're going to the Harper farm." Within minutes, they were ready. Mercy with her leather bag of herbs and implements, Silas with blankets and a small wooden box that Pritchard suspected contained items he'd rather not know about. The three of them rode through the snow in silence, arriving at the Harper farm as afternoon faded toward dusk. The scene inside the farmhouse struck Pritchard with its desperate familiarity. He'd witnessed similar deathbed vigils a dozen times already this season. Ruth lay motionless on a rough bed, her small body barely raising the quilts covering her. Ellen Harper sat beside her daughter, face haggard with sleeplessness and fear. Thomas Harper stood near the fireplace, his expression cycling between hope and hostility as the Thornes entered. Mercy ignored the tension, moving directly to the girl's bedside. She placed one hand on Ruth's forehead and the other over her heart, standing motionless for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried absolute certainty. "She's been touched by threshold awareness. Her mind crossed a boundary it wasn't prepared to navigate, and now it can't find its way back. If we don't retrieve her soon, she'll slip entirely into the spaces between, and no medicine will reach her there." "Speak plainly," Thomas Harper demanded. "What's wrong with my daughter?" Mercy turned to face him. "Your daughter saw something true that most people never glimpse. The weight of that truth is crushing her mind because she has no framework to contain it. I can help, but only if you trust me completely and ask no questions about my methods. Can you do that, Mr. Harper? Can you allow strangeness into your home if it means saving your child?" The silence stretched unbearably. Ellen Harper broke it. "Do whatever you must. Save her. Nothing else matters." Mercy nodded and began unpacking her leather bag. She arranged items on a small table drawn close to the bed, bundles of dried herbs, small carved stones, a copper bowl, and a bell identical to the ones Pritchard had seen at Ezekiel's burial. She instructed Silas to heat water and Ellen to hold Ruth's hand throughout what would follow. Then she began her work. What Pritchard witnessed over the next hour defied his attempts at categorization. Mercy performed actions that resembled medicine, applying poultices, administering tinctures, monitoring breath and pulse. But she also did things that belonged to no medical tradition he recognized. She burned specific herbs and directed the smoke to flow over Ruth's body in patterns that suggested intentionality beyond simple fumigation. She placed the carved stones at points around the bed that corresponded to no anatomical logic. She rang the copper bell in sequences that created harmonics Pritchard felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. And she spoke, a continuous low murmur in that same hybrid language Reverend Ashford had described from Ezekiel's burial, syllables that flowed between recognizable words and pure sound. Pritchard caught fragments that sounded like Gaelic: threshold, return, path home. He heard what might have been Cherokee: healing, balance, spirit walks back, and beneath it all, sounds that belonged to no human language he knew, acoustic patterns that seemed to resonate with the limestone bedrock beneath the farm. Ruth began to respond. Her breathing, which had been shallow and irregular, deepened and steadied. Color returned to her cheeks. Her eyes, which had been open but unseeing, focused and tracked movement. And then she spoke, her voice small but clear. "I see it now. I understand. They're not keeping death out. They're keeping emptiness from spreading. 7 marks the boundary, 9 closes the door, 0 is the nothing they keep outside." She repeated the phrase 3 times, and with each repetition, the fever visibly broke. Sweat beaded on her forehead and soaked through her nightgown, but it was the healthy sweat of a fever burning out rather than the cold sweat of approaching death. Ellen Harper sobbed with relief, pressing her daughter's hand against her cheek. Thomas Harper stood frozen by the fireplace, his face showing the complex calculation of gratitude battling prejudice. Mercy rang the bell one final time, a clear, sustained tone that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should have allowed. As the sound faded, Ruth's eyes closed, and she fell into natural sleep, her breathing deep and regular. The crisis had passed. "She'll wake in a few hours," Mercy said, packing her implements back into the leather bag. "Give her broth and weak tea. Let her rest for 3 days before resuming normal activity. And Mr. Harper," she fixed him with a level stare, "your daughter has been marked by what she's seen. She'll always be sensitive to the thresholds now, always aware of boundaries most people never notice. That's neither curse nor blessing. It simply is. How you respond to her difference will determine whether that awareness becomes gift or burden." Thomas Harper opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Finally, he managed words. "Thank you. I don't understand what you did or how it worked, but thank you." "Understanding isn't required for gratitude," Mercy replied, "only honesty. You're welcome." As the Thornes prepared to depart, Pritchard followed them outside into the snowfall. "Mrs. Thorne, wait. I need to ask you something." Mercy turned, patient despite obvious exhaustion. Ask. The death records I've been keeping, the patterns I've noticed. Am I correct in thinking that your family's work somehow limits the mortality from these seasonal outbreaks? That without you, the numbers would be higher? You're close, Mercy said, but not quite precise. We don't limit death. Death comes for everyone eventually, in quantities the universe seems to require. What we limit is the spread of meaninglessness. When thresholds fail, when boundaries thin too much, emptiness leaks through. Not ghosts or demons, those are just stories people tell. What leaks through is absence, the void. And absence spreads like sickness, draining meaning from life until people forget why they bother living at all. That manifests as disease sometimes, despair other times, violence occasionally. The symptoms vary. The source is consistent. And your family seals these thresholds? We maintain the seals others created long ago, Mercy corrected. This land had keepers before white settlers arrived. It had keepers before the Cherokee were forced here from the east. It had keepers going back further than oral tradition remembers. My husband's people learned the work in older countries and carried it across the ocean. When we came to these hills and found thresholds failing from neglect, we stayed. Someone had to, that's all. Pritchard absorbed this, his scientific mind struggling to integrate it with his empirical observations. What happens now, with Ezekiel gone and Silas uncertain? Now. Mercy looked toward her son, who stood silent beside the horses. Now we see whether knowledge survives another generation or dies with mine. I can maintain what's already sealed, but I can't create new wards. That requires strength and resonance I no longer possess. If Silas walks away, the work continues degraded until it fails completely. And when it fails, she shrugged, I suppose you'll document the results in your careful ledgers. Higher mortality, more disease, increased violence and despair. You'll search for rational explanations and perhaps find some that satisfy you. But you'll also wonder late at night when sleep won't come, whether you could have done something different. The accusation was gentle, but unmistakable. Pritchard felt it land. What would you have me do? Tell the truth, Mercy said simply. Document, not just the pattern, but your interpretation of it. Let your records show that the Thorne family's presence correlated with reduced suffering. You don't have to explain the mechanism. You probably couldn't, and most wouldn't believe you anyway, but you can establish the correlation. You can make it harder for people to maintain their comfortable ignorance. That's not much, but it's more than silence offers. With that, the Thornes mounted their horses and rode back toward their hollow, disappearing into the snowfall like shadows erased by light. Pritchard stood watching until they'd vanished completely, then returned inside to find Thomas Harper staring at his sleeping daughter with an expression that mixed wonder and uncertainty. "Did you see what she did?" Harper asked. "The herbs and stones and that bell? It wasn't natural, Samuel, wasn't Christian." "It was effective," Pritchard replied. "Your daughter lives. Does the method matter as much as the result?" "Yes," Harper said, then immediately reconsidered. "No, I don't know. Everything I was taught says what I witnessed was witchcraft. But everything I feel as Ruth's father says I just witnessed healing. How do I reconcile that?" "Perhaps," Pritchard suggested, "the categories we've been using aren't adequate to the reality we're encountering. Perhaps the universe is stranger and larger than our comfortable definitions allow. And perhaps wisdom lies in adjusting our understanding rather than rejecting what doesn't fit." Over the following weeks, as November deepened toward winter, Pritchard documented everything. The disease outbreak concluded at 17 deaths total, precisely the average from the previous 6 years. He noted this in his official records with careful annotation about historical comparisons. He also began a separate private journal, where he recorded his observations about the Thorne family, the bells, the patterns, and his growing conviction that reality operated according to principles both science and religion had failed to adequately describe. Reverend Ashford, meanwhile, faced his own crisis of integration. His Sunday sermons began shifting subtly, incorporating language about mystery and the limits of human understanding. He spoke less about doctrinal certainty and more about the humility required to navigate a creation whose edges remained unmapped. Some congregants appreciated the new depth. Others worried their reverend had been contaminated by contact with the Thornes' strangeness. The controversy came to a head at a town meeting in late November, called ostensibly to discuss preparations for winter, but actually serving as a forum for the township's anxiety. Reverend Ashford stood before his community and made a decision that would define his ministry. "I visited the Thorne homestead," he announced. "I witnessed their burial practices. And I'm here to tell you that while their methods are unfamiliar and their traditions diverge significantly from ours, I found no evil in them. I found difference, yes, mystery, certainly, but also dedication, sacrifice, and what I can only describe as faithful stewardship of responsibilities most of us would refuse if offered." He paused, surveying the assembled faces. "We've treated this family with suspicion when we should have offered gratitude. We've isolated them when we should have honored their service. And we've allowed fear to blind us to the possibility that God's universe is far stranger and more wonderful than our comfortable theologies admit." The silence that followed held both shock and grudging consideration. Then Martha Greaves stood, her presence commanding despite her small stature. "I've kept my silence for 3 years," she declared. "No longer. I've witnessed Mercy Thorne save lives that would have been lost to my limited skills. I've seen her turn fevers, set impossible breaks, and deliver babies who weren't positioned to survive. She's never asked for payment beyond basic supplies. She's never boasted of her abilities. She's simply done the work quietly, while this community whispered about her as if she were a threat." Martha's gaze swept the room. "We owe the Thornes an apology. And more than that, we owe them support. Ezekiel is dead. Mercy grows older. If we want their protection, and yes, I believe it is protection, to continue, we need to make their work easier, not harder." The meeting dissolved into heated discussion, opinions dividing along lines of fear versus gratitude, tradition versus pragmatism. But a seed had been planted. Slowly, grudgingly, Salem's attitude toward the Thorne family began to shift. Not to acceptance, that would take another generation, but toward something resembling cautious tolerance. Meanwhile, in the hollow by Weaver Creek, Silas faced his own reckoning. He stood at his father's grave in falling snow, staring at the completed marker that represented his tentative acceptance of generational duty. His mother worked in the cabin below, preparing their evening meal. The Belled Buzzard perched in a distant tree, watching with eyes that held more intelligence than any bird should possess. "I don't want this," Silas said aloud to his father's grave, to the watching bird, to whatever forces might be listening. "I want a normal life with normal work and normal neighbors who don't make warning signs when I pass. I want love without suspicion, community without isolation, purpose without mystery. Is that wrong? Is it weak to want simple things?" No answer came, but the silence felt less empty than before. Silas knelt and brushed snow from the grave marker, tracing the 7 radiating lines with cold fingers. 7 marks the boundary. 9 closes the door. 0 is the nothing we keep outside. He'd carved those symbols without fully understanding them, continuing work his father had started because it needed finishing. But in the carving, something had shifted. The chisel had felt right in his hand. The pattern had emerged naturally, as if his muscles remembered what his mind hadn't learned, and when the final circle was completed, he'd felt something. Satisfaction, maybe, or the click of a lock engaging the sense of work properly done. Perhaps purpose didn't have to be chosen enthusiastically. Perhaps it could be accepted reluctantly, adopted gradually, grown into over time. Perhaps he could maintain the boundaries not because he fully understood them, but because someone needed to, and he was the one with the tools and the training, whether he'd wanted either or not. "I'll try," Silas said to the grave. "I'll stay, at least for now. I'll learn what you knew and Pa knew, and all the ones before. I'll carve the symbols and tend the thresholds, but I won't pretend to like it, and I won't stop hoping that someday, somehow, this work becomes something more than duty." Above him, the Belled Buzzard spread its wings and launched skyward, circling once before disappearing into the grey November sky. Its bell tolled faintly, but this time the sound felt less like warning and more like acknowledgement. The threshold held, the work continued, and in a hollow that most people avoided, a family's strange vigil entered its next generation. Coder Samuel Pritchard's private journal, entry dated December 7th, 1853. The disease outbreak has concluded at 17 deaths total, matching the 6-year average since the Thorne family's arrival. Historical records show pre-1847 mortality rates exceeded 25 deaths per seasonal outbreak. The correlation is undeniable, though the mechanism remains beyond my ability to explain through conventional science. I've documented everything I witnessed, the bells that echoed from the caves, Mercy Thorne's healing practices, the symbols carved on grave markers facing west instead of east. I don't understand any of it, but I understand this. Sometimes protection looks strange to those being protected. Sometimes salvation comes from sources we'd rather dismiss as dangerous, because acknowledging them requires admitting our understanding is incomplete. The Thorne family continues their work in isolation, barely tolerated by a community they serve without acknowledgement. History will forget them. My records may be the only testament to their service. So let this journal stand as evidence that in Christian County, Missouri, in the autumn of 1853, a family maintained boundaries most people never noticed, paid prices no one thanked them for, and held back darkness that wore the subtle face of emptiness rather than the dramatic mask of demons. May their bells keep tolling, may their thresholds hold, and may future generations prove wiser than ours in recognizing the value of those who do necessary work in obscurity. The snow fell clean and white across the Ozark Mountains, covering graves that faced west, muffling the sound of bells that rang from deep places, and blanketing a world that was stranger, larger, and more carefully maintained than most of its inhabitants would ever know.